A Droving Yarn by Henry Lawson for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection numbered 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. A Droving Yarn. Andy McCulloch had heard that old Bill Barker, the well-known overland drover, had died over on the Westralian side, and Dave Regan told a yarn about Bill.
Bill Barker, said Dave, talking round his pipe stem, was the quintessence of a drover.
"The whatter, Dave?" came the voice of Jim Bentley in startled tones from the gloom on the far end of the verandah.
"The quintessence," said Dave, taking his pipe out of his mouth. "You shut up, Jim. As I said, Bill Barker was the quintessence of a drover. He'd been at the game ever since he was a nipper. He run away from home when he was 14 and went up into Queensland. He's been all over Queensland and New South Wales and most of South Australia, and a good deal of the Western too, over the great stock routes from one end to the other. Lord knows how many times. No man could keep up with him riding out, and no one could bring a mob of cattle or a flock of sheep through like him. He knew every trick of the game. If there was grass to be had, Bill'd get it, no matter whose run it was on. One of his games in a dry season was to let his mob get boxed with the station stock on a run where there was grass, and before Bill's men and the station hands could cut 'em out, the travelling stock would have a good bellyful to carry them on the track. Billy was the daddy of the drovers. Some said that he could ride in his sleep, and that he had one old horse that could jog along in his sleep too, and that, travelling out from home to take charge of a mob of bullocks or a flock of sheep, Bill and his horse would wake up at daylight and blink round to see where they were and how far they'd got. Then Bill would make a fire and boil his quart pot and roast a bit of mutton while his horse had a mouthful of grass and a spell. You remember Bill, Andy? Big, dark man and a joker of the loud sort. Never slept with a blanket over him, always folded under him on the sand or grass. Seldom wore a coat on the route, though he always carried one with him in case he came across a bush ball or a funeral. Moleskins, flannel waistcoat, cabbage tree hat and lastic-sided boots. When it was roasting hot on the plains and the men swore at the heat, Jim would yell, "Call this hot? Why, you blanks, I'm freezing. Where's me overcoat?" When it was raining and hailing and freezing on Bell's Line and the Blue Mountains in winter, and someone shivered and asked, "Is it cold enough for you now, Bill?" "Cold," Bill would bellow. "I'm sweating." I remember it well. I was little more than a youngster then. Bill Barker came past our place with about 1,000 fat sheep for the Homebush sale yards at Sydney, and he gave me a job to help him down with them on Bell's Line over the mountains, and mighty proud I was to go with him, I can tell you. One night we camped on the Cudgegong River. The country was dry and pretty close cropped, and we'd been sweating the paddocks all along there for our horses. You see, when there weren't slip rails handy, we'd just take the tomahawk and nick the top of a straight grain fence post just above the mortise, knock out the wood there, lift the top rail out and down, and jump the horses in over the lower one. It was all 2 rail fences round there with sheep wires under the lower rail. And about daylight we'd have the horses out, lift back the rail, and fit in the chock that we'd knocked out. Simple as striking matches, wasn't it? Well, the horses were getting a good bellyful in the police horse paddock at night, and Bill took the first watch with the sheep. It was very cold and frosty on the flat, and he thought the sheep might make back for the ridges. It's always warmer up in the ridges in winter out of the frost. Bill roused me out about midnight. "There's the sheep," he says, pointing to a white blur. "They've settled down. I think they'll be quiet till daylight. Don't go round 'em. There's no occasion to go near 'em. You can stop by the fire and keep an eye on 'em." The night seemed very long. I watched and smoked and toasted my shins and warmed the billy now and then, and thought up pretty much the same sort of old things that fellas on night watch think over all over the world. Bill lay on his blanket, with his back to the fire and his arm under his head, freezing on one side and roasting on the other. He never moved. I itched once or twice to turn him over and bake the front of him. I reckoned he was about done behind. At last daylight showed. I took the billy and started down to the river to get some water to make coffee, but halfway down, near the sheep camp, I stopped and stared. I was never so surprised in my life. The white blur of sheep had developed into a couple of acres of long dead silver grass. I woke Bill, and he swore as I never heard a man swear before, nor since. He swore at the sheep, and the grass, and at me, but it would have wasted time, and besides I was too sleepy and tired to fight. But we found those sheep scattered over a scrubby ridge about 7 miles back, so they must have slipped away back of the grass and started early in Bill's watch, and Bill must have watched that blessed grass for the first half of the night and then set me to watch it. He couldn't get away from that. I wondered what the chaps would say if it got round that Bill Barker, the boss overland drover, had lost 1,000 sheep in clear country with fences all round. And I suppose he thought that way too, for he kept me with him right down to Homebush, and when he paid me off he threw in an extra quid and he said, "Now listen here, Dave. If I ever hear a word from anyone about watching that gory grass, I'll find you, Dave, and murder you if you're in wide Australia. I'll screw your neck, so look out." But he's dead now, so it doesn't matter.
There was silence for some time after Dave had finished. The chaps made no comment on the yarn, either one way or the other, but sat smoking thoughtfully and in a vague atmosphere as of sadness, as if they'd just heard of their mother's death and had not been listening to an allegedly humorous yarn. Then the voice of old Peter, the station hand, was heard to growl from the darkness at the end of the hut, where he sat on a 3-bushel bag on the ground with his back to the slabs.
"What's old Peter growling about?"
someone asked.
"He wants to know where Dave got that word,"
someone else replied.
"What word?"
"Quintessence."
There was a chuckle. "He got it out back, Peter," said Mitchell the shearer. "He got it from a new chum."
"How much did you give for it, Dave?" growled Peter.
5 shillings, Peter," said Dave round his pipe stem, "and stick of tobacco thrown in."
Peter seemed satisfied, for he was heard no more that evening. End of A Droving Yarn by Henry Lawson for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 10, War and Conflict. Recording by Son of the Exiles.
This is an excerpt from the Whores and Bawds answer to the 15 Comforts of Whoring, recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This excerpt has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. The Second Comfort of Whoring, answered. Now, when a maid has cracked her maidenhead by being once or twice, sir, brought to bed, her credit then's so broke that all her wit and policy cannot a husband get. But yet not being out of heart she cries, from marriage keeping I shall be more wise, for if he's not a fool he soon will find I had before I'd him to some been kind. Then how he'd call me arrant bitch and whore, and swear some stallion had been there before. Then leave me, wherefore I will single live, and my invention to decoying give. For as I was by fickle man betrayed, so men by me too shall be bubbles made, till the dull sots clandestine means do take in robbing masters for a strumpet's sake. For which if they should at the gallows swing, their end I'd in some merry ditty sing. End of the Second Comfort of Warring, Answered. Recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Number 10, War and Conflict.
Lepanto by G.K. Chesterton, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. Lepanto by G.K. Chesterton, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. White founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the Soldan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men feared. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips. For the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. They have dared the white republics up the capes of Italy. They have dashed the Adriatic round the Lion of the Sea. And the Pope has cast his arms abroad for agony and loss, and called the kings of Christendom for swords about the cross. The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the Mass. From evening isles fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun, and the Lord upon the golden horn is laughing in the sun. Dim drums throbbing in the hills half heard, where only on a nameless throne a crownless prince has stirred, where, risen from a doubtful seat and half attainted stall, the last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall. The last and lingering troubadour, to whom the bird has sung, that once went singing southward when all the world was young. In that enormous silence, tiny and unafraid, comes up along a winding road the noise of the crusade. Strong gongs groaning as the guns boom far, Don John of Austria is going to the war. Stiff flags straining in the night blasts cold, in the gloom black purple, in the glint old gold. Torchlight crimson on the copper kettle drums, then the tuckets, then the trumpets, then the cannons, and he comes. Don John laughing in the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world, holding his head up for a flag of all the free. Love light of Spain, hurrah! Death light of Africa, Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Mahound is in his paradise above the evening star. Don John of Austria is going to the war. He moves a mighty turban on the timeless Houri's knees, his turban that is woven of the sunsets and the seas. He shakes the peacock gardens as he rises from his ease, and he strides among the treetops, and is taller than the trees, and his voice through all the garden is a thunder sent to bring Black Azrael and Ariel and Ammon on the wing, giants in the genii, multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. They rush in red and purple from the red clouds of the morn, from the temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. They rise in green robes roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. On them the sea valves cluster and the grey sea forests curl, splashed with a splendid sickness, the sickness of the pearl. They swell in sapphire smoke out of the blue cracks of the ground. They gather and they wonder and give worship to Mahound. And he saith, "Break up the mountains where the hermit folk can hide, and sift the red and silver sands, lest bone of saint abide. And chase Segura's flying night and day, not giving rest, for that which was our trouble comes again out of the west. We have set the seal of Solomon on all things under sun, of knowledge and of sorrow and endurance of things done. But a noise is in the mountains, and I know the voice that shook our palaces 400 years ago." It is he that saith not Kismet, it is he that knows not fate. It is Richard, it is Raymond, it is Godfrey at the gate. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. Put down your feet upon him, that our peace be on the earth. For he heard drums groaning and he heard guns jar. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Sudden and still, hurrah, bolt from Iberia, Don John of Austria is gone by Alcalá. St. Michael's on his mountain, in the sea roads of the north, Don John of Austria is girt and going forth, where the grey seas glitter and the sharp tides shift, and the sea folk labour and the red sails lift. He shakes his lance of iron and he claps his wings of stone. The noise is gone through Normandy, the noise is gone alone. The north is full of tangled things and texts and aching eyes, and dead is all the innocence of anger and surprise. And Christian killeth Christian in a narrow dusty room, and Christian dreadeth Christ that hath a newer face of doom, and Christian hateth Mary that God kissed in Galilee. But Don John of Austria is riding to the sea, Don John calling through the blast and the eclipse, crying with the trumpet of his lips, trumpet that saith, Ha! Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria is shouting to the ships. King Philip's in his closet with the fleece about his neck. Don John of Austria is armed upon the deck. The walls are hung with velvet that is black and soft as sin, and little dwarfs creep out of it, and little dwarfs creep in. He holds a crystal phial that has colours like the moon. He touches, and it tingles, and he trembles very soon. And his face is as a fungus of a leprous white and grey, like plants in the high houses that are shuttered from the day, and death is in the phial, and the end of noble work. But Don John of Austria has fired upon the Turk. Don John's hunting, and his hounds have bayed. Booms away past Italy the rumour of his raid. Gun upon gun, ha ha, gun upon gun, hurrah! Don John of Austria has loosed the cannonade. The Pope was in his chapel before day or battle broke. Don John of Austria is hidden in the smoke. The hidden room in man's house where God sits all the year, the secret window whence the world looks small and very dear. He sees as in a mirror on the monstrous twilight sea the crescent of his cruel ships whose name is Mystery. They fling great shadows forwards, making cross and castle dark. They veil the plumed lions on the galleys of St. Mark, and above the ships are palaces of brown black-bearded chiefs, and below the ships are prisons, where with multitudinous griefs Christian captives, sick and sunless, all a labouring race repines, like a race in sunken cities, like a nation in the mines. They are lost like slaves that sweat, and in the skies of morning hung the stairways of the tallest gods when tyranny was young. They are countless, voiceless, hopeless, as those fallen or fleeing on before the high king's horses in the granite of Babylon. And many a one grows witless in his quiet room in hell, where a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell. And he finds his God forgotten, and he seeks no more a sign. But Don John of Austria has burst the battle line, Don John pounding from the slaughter-painted poop, purpling all the ocean like a bloody pirate's sloop, scarlet running over on the silvers and the golds, breaking of the hatches up, and bursting of the holds, thronging of the thousands up that labour under sea, white for bliss, and blind for sun, and stunned for liberty. Vivat Hispania, Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria has set his people free. Cervantes, on his galley, sets the sword back in the sheath. Don John of Austria rides homeward with a wreath. And he sees across a weary land a straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight for ever rides in vain. And he smiles, but not a sultan's smile, and settles back the blade. But Don John of Austria rides home from the crusade. End of Lepanto by G.K. Chesterton for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. To Lucasta, Going to the Wars by Richard Lovelace for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. To Lucasta, Going to the Wars by Richard Lovelace for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as thou too shalt adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more. End of To Lucasta, Going to the Wars by Richard Lovelace for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
A March in the Ranks Hard Pressed and the Road Unknown by Walt Whitman for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winston Tharp. A March in the Ranks Hard Pressed and the Road Unknown by Walt Whitman for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. A march in the ranks hard pressed and the road unknown, a route through a heavy wood with muffled steps in the darkness, our army foiled with loss severe and the sullen remnant retreating, till after midnight glimmer upon us the lights of a dim-lighted building. We come to an open space in the woods, and halt by the dim-lighted building. 'Tis an old church at the crossing roads. 'Tis now an impromptu hospital. Entering but for a minute, I see a sight beyond all the pictures and poems ever made. Shadows of deepest, deepest black, just lit by moving candles and lamps, and by one great pitchy torch, stationary, with wild red flame and clouds of smoke. By these crowds, groups of forms vaguely I see on the floor, some in the pews laid down. At my feet, more distinctly, a soldier, a mere lad, in danger of bleeding to death. He is shot in the abdomen. I staunch the blood temporarily. The youngster's face is white as a lily. Then before I depart, I sweep my eyes o'er the scene, fain to absorb it all. Faces, varieties, postures beyond description, most in obscurity, some of them dead. Surgeons operating, attendants holding lights, the smell of ether, the odor of blood. The crowd, oh, the crowd of the bloody forms of soldiers. The yard outside also filled. Some on the bare ground, some on planks or stretchers, some in the death spasm sweating. An occasional scream or cry, the doctor's shouted orders or calls, the glisten of the little steel instruments catching the glint of the torches. These I resume as I chant. I see again the forms, I smell the odor, then hear outside the orders given. Fall in, my men, fall in. But first I bend to the dying lad, his eyes open, a half smile gives he me. Then the eyes close, calmly close, and I speed forth to the darkness, resuming, marching, ever in darkness, marching on in the ranks, the unknown road, still marching. End of A March in the Ranks Hard Pressed and the Road Unknown by Walt Whitman. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
Fall in, my men, Fall In by Henry Lawson for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Reader's comment. The poet acknowledges that the poem's title and refrain were inspired by a line from the Walt Whitman poem, A March in the Ranks Hard Pressed and the Road Unknown. Fall in, my men, fall in. The short hour's halt is ended, the red gone from the west, the broken wheel is mended, and the dead man laid to rest. 3 days have we retreated, the brave old curse and grin, outnumbered and defeated. Fall in, my men, fall in. Poor weary hungry sinners, past caring and past fear, the campfires of the winners are gleaming in the rear. Each day their front advances, each day the same old din, but freedom holds the chances. Fall in, my men, fall in. Despair's cold finger searches, the sky is black ahead. We leave in barns and churches our wounded and our dead. Through cold and rain and darkness, and mire that clogs like sin, in failure in its starkness, fall in, my men, fall in. We go and know not whither, nor see the tracks we go. A horseman gaunt shall tell us, a rain-veiled light shall show. By wood and swamp and mountain the long dark hours begin. Before our fresh wounds stiffen, fall in, my men, fall in. With old wounds dully aching, fall in, my men, fall in. See yonder starlight breaking through rifts where storm clouds thin. See yonder cleared sky arching the distant range upon. I'll plan while we are marching. Move on, my men, march on. End of Fall In, My Men, Fall In by Henry Lawson for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 10, War and Conflict. Recording by Son of the Exiles.
A Speculation on English History by Anonymous for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Speculation on English History by Anonymous from The Gentleman's Magazine for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Like other unhappy folk who are habitually immured in smoky London, we now and then get tired of our prison, and we then break away for a brief season. Unluckily, but too truly, habits are not changed as easily as places, and old occupations soon reassert their sway. We have left black letter chronicles and more formidable looking close rolls and patent rolls and ministers' accounts behind us, and we think that we have forgotten them for the first day or two of our saunters on the beach, or our brisk walks over the green uplands. It is quite a mistake, however. Grim historical figures quickly begin to people the scene, and, forgetting that we have come out for a holiday, we are soon, mentally at least, as busy as ever. But as some little counterpoise, we now and then manage to make the historical study to which we incline take somewhat of a shadowy, imaginative form. It is work, and that of no light kind, in many instances, to discover the real course of events, so much are the received narratives coloured by passion or prejudice, but it is a pleasant, and perhaps not quite an unprofitable exercise of the fancy to speculate how different might have been the course of history if only the victors and the vanquished had changed places now and then, and the halters and the crowns had been fitted to other necks and heads than they really were. A stroll on Deal Beach lately threw us into a reverie of this kind, concerning a skirmish little known to fame that once occurred there. As Professor Creasy has not included it among his 15 Decisive Battles of the World, will our readers consider it with us? Our regret is that we cannot communicate to them the bright sun, the gay coloured flowers, the brisk breeze, and the indescribable feeling of enjoyment which the seashore always has for us, and which we trust they will realise for themselves ere this glorious summertide passes away. We were at Sandwich, once the great Kentish seaport, but now how changed, and a morning even brighter than usual caused us to prolong our early walk to the border of old ocean. The tract we traversed was half marsh, half sandhill, yet to our eyes it had both interest and beauty. Shallow pools half filled with handsome flowering plants, and alternating with hillocks of the most vivid green, perhaps indicated the site of Caesar's naval camp. At least local antiquaries have said so. Behind us was the great Norman church tower of St. Clement, which has survived the castle and the town walls how often churches do. Before us the heaving, sparkling, bright blue sea, and on its margin sundry unpicturesque coastguard stations. These are mostly placed within the circuit of batteries commenced, but never finished, some 60 years ago, to resist that French invasion which has never come yet. Of one of these batteries the wall was not much above a yard high, though 5 times as thick, and there we paused to admire its covering of herbage and wild flowers. Our botanical knowledge being speedily exhausted, we seated ourselves on a hillock, and glancing seaward we soon fell into a day dream. A man-of-war steamer and its ugly trail of smoke on the verge of the horizon did not belong to the 15th century any more than the battery by which we sat, but these forgotten for the moment, probably there was very little difference in the aspect of Deal Beach from what it presented on the 2nd day of July, 1495, just 368 years ago. The following day then presented a wondrous change, such a change as we trust shall not fall on our sea-girt isle in our time at least. A fleet from Flanders came into the Downs, and it was laden, according to a chronicler who wrote under the Tudors, with "a great army of valiant captains of all nations, some bankrupts, some false English sanctuary men, some thieves, robbers, and vagabonds." Of this "rabblement of knaves," as Hall calls them, a few landed, and announced that their leader, Richard of York, had come to recover his inheritance from the usurping Henry Tudor. The Kentish men, according to the same authority, at first hesitated what to do, but at length we record it with grief, for we love Kent they made up their minds, and acted basely. By fair promises and friendly words they lured no small force on shore, and when they had drawn them near to Sandwich the trained bands of the town assailed them, killed many, drove others to their ships, and took 169 prisoners, who being delivered to Sir John Peachey, the Sheriff of Kent, were by him brought to London, railed in ropes, like horses drawing in a cart, transferred at the bridge foot to the care of Nicholas Olwyn and John Warner, the sheriffs, tried off hand, and all executed. Their chief had meanwhile returned to Flanders, and was thus reserved for many strange chances and changes before his own career was terminated in like manner. There is a sort of contagion in success, which when we first hear of a battle lost and won leads us to identify ourselves with the victors, and to have small regard for the vanquished, but in time more generous feelings take possession of our minds. We can afford to pity those to whom Dame Fortune has proved adverse, and we may perhaps discover that victory is not an infallible test of right. Such at least was the train of thought into which we fell on the scene of this attempt to reduce the fortunate, but innately base, Henry of Richmond from a king to a fugitive. We were ready to believe that Hall's unflattering description of the supporters of the false Duke might be true in the main, but we thought it might be equally applicable to Richmond's host at Bosworth. Of the fight among the sandhills we know nothing but the result, as related by the victors, and that his worship William Salmon, the Mayor of Sandwich, was duly thanked for his exertions. Had the day, however, gone otherwise, what a number of crimes Richard of Gloucester would have escaped! He certainly would not have been charged with the murder of more than one nephew, and we probably should never have been taught to believe that he poisoned his wife, procured the death of his brother Clarence, defamed his own mother, or shed the blood of the young Lancastrian prince at Tewkesbury, or of his father in the Tower. Indeed, the cloudy rhetoric of Rous of Warwick, as well as the learning of Sir Thomas More, and the genius of Shakespeare, might probably have been employed in celebrating the virtues of the House of York. Then how widely different, it may be assumed, would the course of events have been under the re-established dynasty? What different names in the peerage, for the successful knaves of course would have been ennobled. The Reformation would doubtless have been in time brought about, as dislike of Rome's assumed power was deeply seated as well as widely spread long before, but we can hardly believe that it would have been accompanied by so many ills as the headstrong self-will, rapacity, and cruelty of Henry VIII. Imported into it. Looking before us, we see the tasteless round tower of Sandown, and remembering that it and similar disfigurements were raised from the ruin of such piles as Fountains and Rievaulx, and Netley and Beaulieu, we execrate the memory of their spoiler, and feel that we do him no wrong when we pronounce him as deficient in love for the beautiful as he notoriously was in honour, gratitude, and kindly feeling. Utterly absorbed in self, he found gratification in gorgeous pageants where he formed the principal figure; but such a spirit has a natural antipathy to goodness, and greatness, and beauty, and whatever of these came within his power was marred to a wilderness. Hence it is no wonder to find him cast aside his broken tools, murder his wives, and delight to hold the lives not only of his people but of his very children at his absolute disposal. At least we have hitherto believed that he did so, and our belief is not quite subverted by the ingenious, if not ingenuous, pleadings of a recent writer, who has laboured with more zeal than success to overthrow all previous opinions regarding Bluff Hal, and has edified the world by depicting him as the pattern of every virtue, his glory slightly, very slightly dimmed by his not being a very attentive husband. For he was a prodigy of learning, a first-rate man of business, and so had not time for the ordinary courtesies of life. But au contraire he was religious, merciful, patient, humble-minded, temperate in all his pleasures, and chaste. Surely a sufficient catalogue of excellencies to excuse his breaking the heart of one wife, divorcing another, menacing a third with the stake, and sending two more to the block. As we have said, we will not carry our speculations so far as to suppose the Reformation other than inevitable, even though Richard IV. Had been crowned at Westminster, and royally tombed at Windsor, and the House of Tudor had never been heard of. But probably its course would have presented many points of difference. The wealth of the monastic orders might have led to their suppression, as it had been fatal to the Templars before them. even though they had not been personally obnoxious to the sovereign as the champions of an injured queen. Hence we may presume that the steps taken against them would have been more moderate, the country would not have lost so many of its noblest edifices, and the contest between the holders of the new and the old opinions might not have proceeded to the extremity of beheading or burning such men as More and Cranmer. Thus, no Pilgrimage of Grace, no Northern Rebellion, no Spanish Armada, no Gunpowder Plot, possibly no Civil War, no Revolution would have a place in English history. But the admirer of genius may probably think there would be cause of regret had Shakespeare not depicted such a character as his Richard III, and it is true that the portraits he has drawn, though it is abundantly evident that many of them are mere political caricatures, have become part and parcel of our history, so that, as a matter of taste, we could not reconcile ourselves to part with them. But would not the varied career of Richard IV. Have furnished as noble a field for the display of "thoughts that breathe and words that burn"? Let us picture to ourselves the young princes in the Tower, one dying, but the living conveyed away instead of the dead by the devotion of some holy priest, the wanderings of the royal boy for many years as unknown in foreign lands, his recognition by the friends of his house, the treacherous watchings of Clifford, its hereditary foe, and other spies, the deaths of Fitzwalter and Stanley, the firm attachment of a more humble friend, John Water, the beauty, the love of Lady Catherine Gordon, a victory, a triumphant entry into London, a coronation, the son of York again in the ascendant. Fancy these painted in such colours as Shakespeare alone could use, and who can doubt that as glorious a drama as any that have proceeded from his pen would have immortalised the strange eventful history of one now condemned by defeat to bear the brand of an impostor, and never perhaps to be rescued from the Tudor imposed nickname of Perkin Warbeck. Another glance at Sandown, a charitable thought for Colonel Hutchinson and others who pined and died there, and we rouse ourselves for the everyday life of the 19th century. End of A Speculation on English History, by Anonymous, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
The Anti-Slavery Alphabet, written by an anonymous author. This has been recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rosalind Carlyle. Listen, little children all, listen to our earnest call. You are very young, 'tis true, but there's much that you can do. Even you can plead with men that they buy not slaves again, and that those they have may be quickly set at liberty. They may hearken what you say, though from us they turn away. Sometimes when from school you walk, you can with your playmates talk. Tell them of the slave child's fate, motherless and desolate, and you can refuse to take candy, sweetmeat, pie, or cake, saying no, unless 'tis free. The slave shall not work for me. Thus, dear little children, each may some useful lesson teach. Thus each one may help to free this fair land from slavery. A is an abolitionist, a man who wants to free the wretched slave and give to all an equal liberty. B is a brother with a skin of somewhat darker hue, but in our Heavenly Father's sight he is as dear as you. C is the cotton field to which this injured brother's driven, when as the white man's slave he toils, from early morn till even. D is the driver, cold and stern, who follows whip in hand, to punish those who dare to rest or disobey command. E is the eagle soaring high, an emblem of the free. But while we chain our brother man, our type he cannot be. F is the heartsick fugitive, the slave who runs away, and travels through the dreary night, but hides himself by day. G is the gong, whose rolling sound before the morning light calls up the little sleeping slave to labour until night. H is the hound his master trained and called to scent the track of the unhappy fugitive and bring him trembling back. I is the infant from the arms of its fond mother torn, and at a public auction sold, with horses, cows, and corn. J is the jail upon whose floor that wretched mother lay, until her cruel master came and carried her away. K is the kidnapper who stole that little child and mother. Shrieking it clung around her, but he tore them from each other. L is the lash that brutally he swung around its head, threatening that if it cried again he'd whip it till 'twas dead. M is the merchant of the north, who buys what slaves produce, so they are stolen, whipped, and worked for his and for our use. N is the Negro, rambling free in his far distant home, delighting 'neath the palm trees' shade, and cocoa nut to roam. O is the orange tree that bloomed beside his cabin door, when white men stole him from his home to see it never more. P is the parent, sorrowing and weeping all alone. The child he loved to lean upon, his only son, is gone. Q is the quarter where the slave on coarsest food is fed, and where with toil and sorrow worn he seeks his wretched bed. R is the rice swamp, dank and lone, where weary, day by day, he labours till the fever wastes his strength and life away. S is the sugar that the slave is toiling hard to make, to put into your pie and tea, your candy and your cake. T is the rank tobacco plant, raised by slave labour too, a poisonous and nasty thing for gentlemen to chew. U is for Upper Canada, where the poor slave has found rest after all his wanderings, for it is British ground. V is the vessel in whose dark, noisome and stifling hold hundreds of Africans are packed, brought o'er the seas and sold. W is the whipping post to which the slave is bound, while on his naked back the lash makes many a bleeding wound. X is for Xerxes, famed of yore, a warrior stern was he. He fought with swords, let truth and love our only weapons be. Y is for youth, the time for all bravely to war with sin, and think not it can ever be too early to begin. Z is a zealous man, sincere, faithful, and just and true, an earnest pleader for the slave. Will you not be so too? End of the Anti-Slavery Alphabet. Recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 10. War and Conflict.
The fourth chapter of the first book of The Adventurous Simplicissimus by Hans Jakob Christoph von Grimmelshausen, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The fourth chapter of the first book of The Adventurous Simplicissimus by Hans Jakob Christoph von Grimmelshausen, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. How Simplicissimus' palace was stormed, plundered, and ruinated, and in what sorry fashion the soldiers kept house there. Although it was not my intention to take the peace-loving reader with these troopers to my dad's house and farm, seeing that matters will go ill therein, yet the course of my history demands that I should leave to kind posterity an account of what manner of cruelties were now and again practised in this our German war. Yea, and moreover testify by my own example that such evils must often have been sent to us by the goodness of Almighty God for our profit. For, gentle reader, who would ever have taught me that there was a God in heaven if these soldiers had not destroyed my dad's house, and by such a deed driven me out among folk who gave me all fitting instruction thereupon? Only a little while before I neither knew nor could fancy to myself that there were any people on earth save only my dad, my mother, and me, and the rest of our household. Nor did I know of any human habitation but that where I daily went out and in. But soon thereafter I understood the way of man's coming into this world, and how they must leave it again. I was only in shape a man, and in name a Christian. For the rest I was but a beast. Yet the Almighty looked upon my innocence with a pitiful eye, and would bring me to a knowledge both of himself and of myself. And although he had 1,000 ways to lead me thereto, yet would he doubtless use that one only, by which my dad and my mother should be punished, and that for an example to all others by reason of the heathenish upbringing of me. The first thing these troopers did was, they stabled their horses. Thereafter each fell to his appointed task, which task was neither more nor less than ruin and destruction. For though some began to slaughter and to boil and to roast, so that it looked as if there should be a merry banquet forward, yet others there were who did but storm through the house, above and below stairs. Others stowed together great parcels of cloth and apparel and all manner of household stuff, as if they would set up a frippery market. All that they had no mind to take with them they cut in pieces. Some thrust their swords through the hay and straw, as if they had not enough sheep and swine to slaughter. And some shook the feathers out of the beds, and in their stead stuffed in bacon and other dried meat and provisions, as if such were better and softer to sleep upon. Others broke the stuff on the windows, as if they had never-ending summer to promise. Houseware of copper and tin they beat flat, and packed such vessels as bent and spoiled in with the rest. Bedsteads, tables, chairs, and benches they burned, though there lay many cords of dry wood in the yard. Pots and pipkins must all go to pieces, either because they would eat none but roast flesh, or because the purpose was to make there but a single meal. Our maiden was so handled in the stable that she could not come out, which is a shame to tell of. Our man they laid bound upon the ground, thrust a gag into his mouth, and poured a pail full of filthy water into his body. By this, which they called a Swedish draught, they forced him to lead a party of them to another place where they captured men and beasts, and brought them back to our farm, in which company were my dad, my mother, and our Ursula. And now they began. First to take the flints out of their pistols, and in place of them to jam the peasants' thumbs in, and so to torture the poor rogues as if they had been about the burning of witches. For one of them they had taken, they thrust into the baking oven, and there lit a fire under him, although he had as yet confessed no crime. As for another, they put a cord round his head, and so twisted it tight with a piece of wood that the blood gushed from his mouth and nose and ears. In a word, each had his own device to torture the peasants, and each peasant his several torture. But as it seemed to me then, my dad was the luckiest, for he with a laughing face confessed what others must out with in the midst of pains and miserable lamentations, and such honour without doubt fell to him because he was the householder. For they set him before a fire and bound him fast, so that he could neither stir hand nor foot, and smeared the soles of his feet with wet salt, and this they made our old goat lick off, and so tickle him that he well nigh burst his sides with laughing. And this seemed to me so merry a thing that I must needs laugh with him for the sake of fellowship, or because I knew no better. In the midst of such laughter he must needs confess all that they would have of him, and indeed revealed to them a secret treasure, which proved far richer in pearls, gold, and trinkets than any would have looked for among peasants. Of the women, girls, and maidservants whom they took, I have not much to say in particular, for the soldiers would not have me see how they dealt with them. Yet this I know, that one heard some of them scream most piteously in divers corners of the house, and well I can judge it fared no better with my mother and our Ursel than with the rest. Yet in the midst of all this miserable ruin I helped to turn the spit, and in the afternoon to give the horses drink, in which employ I encountered our maid in the stable, who seemed to me wondrously tumbled, so that I knew her not. But with a weak voice she called to me, "O lad, run away, or the troopers will have thee away with them. Look to it well that thou get hence. Thou seest in what plight—" And more she could not say. End of the 4th chapter of the first book of The Adventurous Simplicissimus by Hans Jakob Christoph von Grimmelshausen. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Recording by Dom Bombadil.
The Bronckhorst Divorce Case by Rudyard Kipling. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Bronckhorst Divorce Case by Rudyard Kipling. From Victorian Stories of Troubled Marriages. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. In the daytime, when she moved about me, in the night when she was sleeping by my side, I was wearied of her presence. Day by day and night by night I grew to hate her. Would God that she or I had died. Confessions. There was a man called Bronckhorst, a three-cornered, middle-aged man in the army, grey as a badger, and, some people said, with a touch of country blood in him. That, however, cannot be proved. Mrs. Bronckhorst was not exactly young, though 15 years younger than her husband. She was a large, pale, quiet woman, with heavy eyelids over weak eyes, and hair that turned red or yellow as the lights fell on it. Bronckhorst was not nice in any way. He had no respect for the pretty public and private lies that make life a little less nasty than it is. His manner towards his wife was coarse. There are many things, including actual assault with the clenched fist, that a wife will endure, but seldom a wife can bear, as Mrs. Bronckhorst bore, with a long course of brutal, hard chaff, making light of her weaknesses, her headaches, her small fits of gaiety, her dresses, her queer little attempts to make herself attractive to her husband when she knows that she is not what she has been, and, worst of all, the love that she spends on her children. That particular sort of heavy-handed jest was specially dear to Bronckhorst. I suppose that he had first slipped into it, meaning no harm, in the honeymoon, when folk find their ordinary stock of endearments run short, and so go to the other extreme to express their feelings. A similar impulse makes a man say, "Hut, you old beast," when a favourite horse nuzzles his coat front. Unluckily, when the reaction of marriage sets in, the form of speech remains, and the tenderness having died out, hurts the wife more than she cares to say. But Mrs. Bronckhorst was devoted to her Teddy, as she called him. Perhaps that was why he objected to her. Perhaps, this is only a theory to account for his infamous behaviour later on, he gave way to the queer, savage feeling that sometimes takes by the throat a husband 20 years married, when he sees, across the table, the same face of his wedded wife, and knows that, as he has sat facing it, so must he continue to sit until the day of its death or his own. Most men and all women know the spasm. It only lasts for 3 breaths as a rule, must be a throwback to times when men and women were rather worse than they are now, and is too unpleasant to be discussed. Dinner at the Bronckhorsts' was an infliction few men cared to undergo. Bronckhorst took a pleasure in saying things that made his wife wince. When their little boy came in at dessert, Bronckhorst used to give him half a glass of wine, and, naturally enough, the poor little mite got first riotous, next miserable, and was removed screaming. Bronckhorst asked if that was the way Teddy usually behaved, and whether Mrs. Bronckhorst could not spare some of her time to teach the little beggar decency. Mrs. Bronckhorst, who loved the boy more than her own life, tried not to cry. Her spirit seemed to have been broken by her marriage. Lastly, Bronckhorst used to say, "There, that'll do, that'll do. For God's sake try to behave like a rational woman. Go into the drawing-room." Mrs. Bronckhorst would go, trying to carry it all off with a smile, and the guest of the evening would feel angry and uncomfortable. After 3 years of this cheerful life, for Mrs. Bronckhorst had no women friends to talk to, the station was startled by the news that Bronckhorst had instituting proceedings on the criminal count against a man called Beale, who certainly had been rather attentive to Mrs. Bronckhorst whenever she had appeared in public. The utter want of reserve with which Bronckhorst treated his own dishonour helped us to know that the evidence against Beale would be entirely circumstantial and native. There were no letters, but Bronckhorst had said openly that he would rack heaven and earth until he saw Beale superintending the manufacture of carpets in the central jail. Mrs. Bronckhorst kept entirely to her house and let charitable folk say what they pleased. Opinions were divided. Some 2/3 of the station jumped at once to the conclusion that Beale was guilty, but a dozen men who knew and liked him held by him. Beale was furious and surprised. He denied the whole thing, and vowed that he would thrash Bronckhorst within an inch of his life. No jury, we knew, would convict a man on the criminal count on native evidence in a land where you can buy a murder charge, including the corpse, all complete for 54 rupees. But Beale did not care to scrape through by the benefit of a doubt. He wanted the whole thing cleared. But, as he said one night, he can prove anything with servants' evidence, and I have only my bare word. This was almost a month before the case came on, and beyond agreeing with Beale, we could do little. All that we could be sure of was that the native evidence would be bad enough to blast Beale's character for the rest of his service, for when a native begins perjury, he perjures himself thoroughly. He does not boggle over details. Some genius at the end of the table whereat the affair was being talked over said, "Look here, I don't believe lawyers are any good. Get a man to wire to Strickland and beg him to come down and pull us through." Strickland was about 180 miles up the line. He had not been married to Miss Youghal, but he scented in the telegram a chance of return to the old detective work that his soul lusted after, and next time he came in and heard our story. He finished his pipe and said oracularly, "We must get at the evidence. Oria Bearer, Mussulman Kit, and Sweeper Aya, I suppose, are the pillars of the charge. I am on this piece, but I'm afraid I'm getting rusty in my talk." He rose and went into Beale's bedroom, where his trunk had been put, and shut the door. An hour later we heard him say, "I hadn't the heart to part with my old make-ups when I married. Will this do?" There was a loathly fakir salaaming in the doorway. "Now lend me 50 rupees," said Strickland, "and give me your words of honour that you won't tell my wife." He got all that he asked for, and left the house while the table drank his health. What he did only he himself knows. A fakir hung about Bronckhorst's compound for 12 days. Then a sweeper appeared, and when Beale heard of him, he said that Strickland was an angel full-fledged. Whether the sweeper made love to Jonky, Mrs. Bronckhorst's Saya, is a question which concerns Strickland exclusively. He came back at the end of 3 weeks, and said quietly, "You spoke the truth, Beale. The whole business is put up from beginning to end. Jove, it almost astonishes me. That Bronckhorst beast isn't fit to live." There was uproar and shouting, and Beale said, "How are you going to prove it? You can't say that you've been trespassing on Bronckhorst's compound in disguise." "No," said Strickland. "Tell your lawyer fool, whoever he is, to get up something strong about inherent improbabilities and discrepancies of evidence. He won't have to speak, but it will make him happy. I'm going to run this business." Beale held his tongue, and the other men waited to see what would happen. They trusted Strickland as men trust quiet men. When the case came off, the court was crowded. Strickland hung about in the veranda of the court till he met the Mohammedan Khitmutgar. Then he murmured a fakir's blessing in his ear, and asked him how his second wife did. The man spun round, and, as he looked into the eyes of Estrikan Sahib, his jaw dropped. You must remember that before Strickland was married, he was, as I have told you already, a power among natives. Strickland whispered a rather coarse vernacular proverb to the effect that he was abreast of all that was going on, and went into the court armed with a gut trainer's whip. The Mohammedan was the first witness, and Strickland beamed upon him from the back of the court. The man moistened his lips with his tongue, and, in his abject fear of Estrakeen Sahib, the fakir went back on every detail of his evidence, said he was a poor man, and God was his witness that he had forgotten everything that Bronckhorst Sahib had told him to say. Between his terror of Strickland, the judge, and Bronckhorst, he collapsed weeping. Then began the panic among the witnesses. Janki, the ayah, leering chastely behind her veil, turned grey, and the bearer left the court. He said that his mamma was dying, and that it was not wholesome for any man to lie unthriftily in the presence of Estrakeen Sahib. Beale said politely to Bronckhorst, "Your witness don't seem to work. Haven't you any forged letters to produce?" But Bronckhorst was swaying to and fro in his chair, and there was a dead pause after Beale had been called to order. Bronckhorst's counsel saw the look on his client's face, and without more ado pitched his papers on the little green baize table, and mumbled something about having been misinformed. The whole court applauded wildly, like soldiers at a theatre, and the judge began to say what he thought. Beale came out of the court, and Strickland dropped a gut trainer's whip in the veranda. 10 minutes later, Beale was cutting Bronckhorst into ribbons behind the old court cells, quietly and without scandal. What was left of Bronckhorst was sent home in a carriage, and his wife wept over it and nursed it into a man again. Later on, after Beale had managed to hush up the countercharge against Bronckhorst of fabricating false evidence, Mrs. Bronckhorst, with her faint, watery smile, said that there had been a mistake, but it wasn't her Teddy's fault altogether. She would wait till her Teddy came back to her. Perhaps he had grown tired of her, or she had tried his patience, and perhaps we wouldn't cut her any more, and perhaps the mothers would let their children play with little Teddy again. He was so lonely. Then the station invited Mrs. Bronckhorst everywhere, until Bronckhorst was fit to appear in public, when he went home and took his wife with him. According to latest advices, her Teddy did come back to her, and they are moderately happy. Though, of course, he can never forgive her the thrashing that she was the indirect means of getting for him. What Beale wants to know is, why didn't I press home the charge against the Bronckhorst brute and have him run in? What Mrs. Strickland wants to know is, how did my husband bring such a lovely, lovely whaler from your station? I know all his money affairs, and I'm certain he didn't buy it. What I want to know is, how do women like Mrs. Bronckhorst come to marry men like Bronckhorst? And my conundrum is the most unanswerable of the three. End of The Bronckhorst Divorce Case by Rudyard Kipling for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Recording by Rosie.
Two Military Executions by Ambrose Bierce for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the spring of the year 1862, General Buell's big army lay in camp, licking itself into shape for the campaign which resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained army, although some of its fractions had seen hard enough service, with a good deal of fighting, in the mountains of West Virginia and in Kentucky. The war was young and soldiering a new industry, imperfectly understood by the young American of the period, who found some features of it not altogether to his liking. Chief among these was that essential part of discipline, subordination. To one imbued from infancy with the fascinating fallacy that all men are born equal, unquestioning submission to authority is not easily mastered, and the American volunteer soldier in his green and salad days is among the worst known. That is how it happened that one of Buell's men, Private Bennett Story Green, committed the indiscretion of striking his officer. Later in the war he would not have done that. Like Sir Andrew Aguecheek, he would have "seen him damned" first. But time for reformation of his military manners was denied him. He was promptly arrested on complaint of the officer, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to be shot. "You might have thrashed me and let it go at that," said the condemned man to the complaining witness. "That is what you used to do at school when you were plain Will Dudley and I was as good as you. Nobody saw me strike you. Discipline would not have suffered much." "Ben Green, I guess you were right about that," said the lieutenant. "Will you forgive me? That is what I came to see you about." There was no reply, and an officer putting his head in at the door of the guard tent where the conversation had occurred, explained that the time allowed for the interview had expired. The next morning, when in the presence of the whole brigade, Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his comrades, Lieutenant Dudley turned his back upon the sorry performance and muttered a prayer for mercy, in which himself was included. A few weeks afterward, as Buell's leading division was being ferried over the Tennessee River to assist in succoring Grant's beaten army, night was coming on, black and stormy. Through the wreck of battle the division moved, inch by inch, in the direction of the enemy who had withdrawn a little to reform his lines. But for the lightning the darkness was absolute. Never for a moment did it cease, and ever when the thunder did not crack and roar, were heard the moans of the wounded among whom the men felt their way with their feet, and upon whom they stumbled in the gloom. The dead were there too. There were dead aplenty. In the first faint gray of the morning, when the swarming advance had paused to resume something of definition as a line of battle, and skirmishers had been thrown forward, word was passed along to call the roll. "Gorham, here. Grayrock, here." The sergeant's good memory was affected by habit. "Green, here." The response was clear, distinct, unmistakable. A sudden movement, an agitation of the entire company front, as from an electric shock, attested the startling character of the incident. The sergeant paled and paused. The captain strode quickly to his side and said sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently the Society for Psychical Research is not first in the field of curiosity concerning the unknown. "Bennett Green, here." All faces turned in the direction of the familiar voice. The two men between whom in the order of stature Green had commonly stood in line turned and squarely confronted each other. "Once more," commanded the inexorable investigator, and once more came, a trifle tremulously, the name of the dead man. "Bennett Story Green. Here." At that instant a single rifle shot was heard, away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, followed, almost attended, by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet which, passing through the line, struck audibly, punctuating as with a full stop the captain's exclamation, "What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed through the ranks from his place in the rear. "It means this," he said, throwing open his coat and displaying a visibly broadening stain of crimson on his breast. His knees gave way, he fell awkwardly and lay dead. A little later the regiment was ordered out of line to relieve the congested front, and through some misplay in the game of battle was not again under fire. Nor did Bennett Green, expert in military executions, ever again signify his presence at one. End of 2 military executions. Recording by David Mack.
Century by Frederick Brown. Recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection Number 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Carlyle. Century. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and he was 50,000 light years from home. A strange blue sun gave light, and the gravity, twice what he was used to, made every movement difficult. But in tens of thousands of years this part of war hadn't changed. The flyboys were fine, with their sleek spaceships and their fancy weapons. When the chips are down, though, it was still the foot soldier, the infantry, that had to take the ground and hold it, foot by bloody foot. Like this damned planet of a star he'd never heard of until they landed him there. And now it was sacred ground because the aliens were there too. The aliens, the only other intelligent race in the galaxy. Cruel, hideous, and repulsive monsters. Contact had been made with them near the center of the galaxy after a slow, difficult colonization of 12,000 planets, and it had been war at sight. They'd shot without even trying to negotiate or to make peace. Now, planet by bitter planet, it was being fought out. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and the day was raw with a high wind that hurt his eyes. But the aliens were trying to infiltrate, and every sentry post was vital. He stayed alert, gun ready. 50,000 light years from home, fighting on a strange world and wondering if he'd ever live to see home again. And then he saw one of them crawling towards him. He drew a bead and fired. The alien made that strange, horrible sound they all make, then lay still. He shuddered at the sound in sight of the alien lying there. One ought to be able to get used to them after a while, but he'd never been able to. Such repulsive creatures they were, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, ghastly white skins and no scales. End of Century by Frederick Brown. Recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 10. War and Conflict.
The Battles of Lewes and Evesham by Mrs. R. Valentine, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Battles of Lewes and Evesham by Mrs. R. Valentine, from Sea Fights and Land Battles from Alfred to Victoria, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. The first great battle fought in England itself, after Hastings, was that of Lewes, unhappily a civil conflict between Henry III and his barons, or rather Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and his party, for the English peers were divided in the conflict. On the royal side fought the great houses of Bigod and Bowen, and the Percys, John Cummin, John Balliol, and Robert Bruce. On the earl's side were Gloucester, Derby, De Roos, Marmion, Grey, Fitzjohn, Seagrave, De Lucy, De Vesey, and other nobles. The royal army was encamped in a hollow near Lewes. In numbers it exceeded that of the rebel peers, but the position was ill chosen, and impeded their movements. Leicester encamped on the Downs. The son of that Count de Montfort known as the cruel persecutor of the Albigenses, he professed great religion; and in token of the holiness of his cause, this foreign champion of English liberties ordered his soldiers to wear a white cross on the breast, as if they had been Crusaders, while his ally, the Bishop of Chichester, gave them a general absolution, assuring them that all who should fall in the approaching strife would have won the crown of martyrdom. The armies joined battle on the 14th of May, 1264, Prince Edward beginning the conflict by desperately attacking a body of Londoners who formed part of the Earl's forces. These citizen soldiers were quite unequal to cope with the men-at-arms of the chivalrous prince. They fled, were pursued, and cut down in heaps. Edward, enraged at the cowardly insults they had lately offered to his mother, was so eager in taking vengeance on them that he pursued them, regardless of prudence, and of the state of the other part of the field. When the Queen was attempting to escape from London to her son at Windsor, the populace on London Bridge uttered cries of "Drown the witch!" and filth and stones were flung at the royal barge. The mayor took pity on the distressed lady, and carried her for safety to St. Paul's. The experienced soldier who led the barons was quick to take advantage of this youthful indiscretion. He made a concentrated attack on the division commanded by the king, and by equal strategy and courage completely defeated the main body of the royal army, taking Henry himself prisoner, before the prince returned from his pursuit of the Londoners; in whose behoof, we may observe, no sort of effort was made by the foreign champion whose cause they served. The astonishment of the victorious Edward when he returned, and found his father and many of his nobles captives, may be imagined. Before he could recover from it, a body of horse charged his exhausted and breathless followers, and the young soldier was taken prisoner. Thus ended the battle of Lewes, which cost the lives of 5,000 Englishmen who were slain by their brethren on that fratricidal field. The power of Leicester was established by this battle, but it was soon to wane. The nobles who had rebelled against their legitimate sovereign were not likely to submit quietly to the rule of a foreign noble, who belonged to the English peerage only in right of his mother, Amicia. The superiority he assumed over them, and the continued captivity of both the king and his son, roused the jealousy and remorse of the barons. The Earl of Derby came over to the royal interests. Gloucester concerted a successful plan for the release of the prince, and as soon as he was free, the royalist chiefs rose again in different parts of the country, after a plan suggested by the military genius of the prince himself. At the same time Earl Warren, who had escaped from the Battle of Lewes, landed with a large body of knights and archers in South Wales. Leicester, carrying the captive king everywhere with him, encamped at Hereford, leaving his son Simon de Montfort in Sussex. Prince Edward gave now the first proof of the great military skill for which he was afterwards famous. He destroyed all the bridges and boats on the Severn, and secured the fords, intending to keep the Earl on the right bank of the river. Nevertheless, Leicester succeeded in crossing, and encamped near Worcester, where he awaited the arrival of his son, who was marching to meet him. But this junction of forces was prevented by Prince Edward. He surprised young Simon by night at Kenilworth, captured his horses, treasure, and many of his knights, and forced him to take refuge, half clad, in the castle, the famous stronghold of the Leicesters. The unfortunate Earl, ignorant of this misfortune, advanced to Evesham on the river Avon. Here, at early morning on the 4th of August, as he looked anxiously towards the hills near Kenilworth, he beheld his own banners advancing towards him. "It is my son, it is Simon!" he exclaimed joyfully. But the joy was of short duration. The war cry of his foes rang shortly afterwards on the air, and he discovered that it was in Royalist hands that the Montfort banners were borne. At the same moment his knights riding up brought tidings that on each flank, and in the rear, the foe was advancing. He was shut in, caught in a snare. As his soldier's eye glanced round and marked the whole position, he exclaimed, "They have learned from me the art of war." Then, after a pause, he added, "The Lord have mercy on our souls, for I see our bodies are Prince Edward's." He made, however, a gallant effort to redeem them, marshalling his men with his wonted skill. Then he took the sacrament and remained some short time in prayer. His best course was plain, that is, to force the road to Kenilworth, and this he attempted, but the effort was vain. He then formed his soldiers into a solid circle at the top of the hill, and thus in a manner entrenched by spears, repulsed several charges of the Royalists, who attacked him at all points. We have said he kept the poor old imbecile king always near him. At Evesham the sovereign, cased in armour, with his visor down, was compelled to mount a war horse and mingle with the rebel ranks. In one of the Prince's charges poor Henry was unhorsed, and in danger of being slain, but Edward heard amid the tumult the cry of a well-known voice, "I am Henry of Winchester, your king," and at once flew to the spot, rescued his father, and bore him tenderly from the mêlée. The great and brave Edward Longshanks was a dutiful and loving son, then and ever. His grief for his poor old father's death is on record. "We can never have a second father," he said mournfully, when asked why he mourned so much more for the King's death, an old man, than for that of his own infant son. But to return to the battle of Evesham. Leicester's horse was killed under him, but the Earl rose from his fallen steed and continued fighting bravely on foot. His Welsh followers were broken, and fled. On every side pressed on the ever-increasing numbers of the foe. "Do you give quarter?" he demanded at last of his antagonists. "No quarter," was the reply, "for a traitor." His gallant son Henry fell beside him. The best and bravest of his adherents lay in heaps on the fatal field. And wearied, worn, and hopeless, the great Earl at last fell, sword in hand, with a dauntless courage worthy of a better cause. The Royalists stained their victory by great and excessive cruelty. Death could not satisfy their vengeance. Leicester's body was mutilated, and 180 of his noblest adherents were slain, no quarter being given, or prisoners made. Thus ended the Battle of Evesham, the last of the Barons' Wars. End of the Battles of Lewes and Evesham, by Mrs. R. Valentine, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
Recrudescence of South's Intolerance by W. Allison Sweeney. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Herard. Recrudescence of South's Intolerance by W. Allison Sweeney, from The American Negro in World War I. Old feelings of race prejudice and intolerance, appearing mainly in the South, confronted the Negro at the beginning of the war. The splendid attitude of the Negro shamed and overcame this feeling in other sections of the country, and was beginning to have its effect even in the South. It is true that men of the race were not accepted for voluntary enlistment in numbers of consequence in any section, but had the voluntary system continued in vogue, the willingness and desire of the race to serve, coupled with the very necessities of the case, would have altered the condition. No new Negro volunteer units were authorized, but the demand for men would soon have made it imperative. It would have been combated by a certain element in the South, but the friends of the few volunteer units which did exist in that section were firm in their championship and were winning adherents to their view that the number should be increased. The selective draft, with its firm dictum that all men within certain ages should be called and the fit ones chosen, put an end to all contention. The act was not passed without bitter opposition, which developed in its greatest intensity among the Southern senators and representatives, feelings that were inspired entirely by opposition to the Negro. It would have been a bad thing for the country, and would have prolonged the war, and possibly might have lost it, if the selective draft had been delayed. But it would have been interesting to see how far the country, especially the South, would have progressed in the matter of raising a volunteer army without excepting Negroes. Undoubtedly, they soon would have been glad to recruit them, even in the South. Unfortunately for the Negro, the draft was not able to prevent their being kept out of the Navy. It is a very desirable branch of the service, vitiated and clouded, however, with many disgusting and aristocratic traditions. When the Navy was young and the service more arduous, when its vessels were merely armed merchantmen, many of them simply tubs and death traps and not the floating castles of today, the services of Negroes were not disdained. But times and national ideals had changed, and the shame of it, not to the credit of a commonwealth for whose birth a Negro had shed the first blood, and a Washington had faced the rigors of a Valley Forge, a Lincoln the bullet of an assassin. The annual report of the Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, rendered to the Secretary of the Navy and covering the fiscal year ending June 30, 1918, showed that in the United States Navy, the United States Naval Reserve Force, and the National Naval Volunteers there was a total of 435,398 men. Of that great number, only 5,328 were Negroes, a trifle over 1%. Between June and November 1918, the Navy was recruited to a total force somewhat in excess of 500,000 men. Carrying out the same percentage, it is apparent that the aggregate number of Negroes serving in the Navy at the close of the war could not have been much in excess of 6,000. Some extra enlistments of Negroes were contemplated, as the Navy had in process of establishment just prior to the armistice a new service for Negro recruits. It was to be somewhat similar to the pioneer units of the Army, partaking in some degree of the character of Marines, just as the pioneers partake of the character of infantry, but in general respects resembling more the engineer and stevedore units. About 600 men had been selected for this service, when the project was abandoned on account of the ending of the war. With the exception of a very limited number who had been permitted to attain the rank of petty officer, Negroes in the Navy were confined to menial occupations. They were attached to the firing forces as coal passers, while others served as cooks, assistants, mess attendants, and in similar duties. Quite a number were full rated cooks. A few were water tenders, electricians, and gunners' mates, each of which occupations entitled them to the aforesaid rank of petty officer. Among the petty officers some had, by sheer merit, attained the rank of chief petty officer, which is about equal to the rank of sergeant in the army. The idea of separate ships for the Negro might to some degree ameliorate the sting incident to race prohibition in that arm of government service. The query is advanced that if we can have black colonels, majors, captains, and lieutenants in the army, why cannot we have black commanders, lieutenants, ensigns, and such in the Navy? Negroes have often and in diverse ways displayed their intelligence and efficiency in the Navy. Take, for instance, the case of John Jordan, a Negro of Virginia, who was chief gunner's mate on Admiral Dewey's flagship, the Olympia, during the Spanish-American War, and was the man who fired the first shot at the enemy at Manila Bay. A Negro chief electrician, Salisbury Brooks, was the originator of inventions which were adopted without reservation by the Navy designers and changed the construction of modern battleships. One of the principal instructors on the U.S.S. Essex, the government training ship at Norfolk, is Matthew Anderson, a Negro. He has trained thousands of men, many of them now officers, in the art and duties of seamanship. Scores of Negroes, men of the type of these in the Navy, would furnish the nucleus for officers and crews of separate Negro ships. In a recent issue of Our Navy, a magazine devoted entirely to naval affairs, especially as regards the enlisted man, A writer reflects the opinion of these men in the following article: "Whether you like the black man or not, whether you believe in a square deal for him or not, you can't point an accusing finger at his patriotism, his Americanism, or his fighting ability. It is fair to neither the white man nor the black man to have the black man compete with the white man in the Navy. True, we have black petty officers here and there in the Navy, and in some cases black chief petty officers. It stands to reason that they must have been mighty good men to advance. They surely must know their business, every inch of it, to advance to these ratings. Yet they are not wanted in these ratings because they involve the black man having charge of white men under him. Outside of the messman branch you will find comparatively few Negroes in the Navy today. There should be black ships assigned to be manned by American Negroes. These are days of democracy, equality, and freedom," continues the writer. "If a man is good enough to go over the top and die for these principles, he is good enough to promote in the Navy. Why not try it? Put the black men on their own ships. Promote them, rate them just the same as the white man. But above all, keep them on their own ships. It is fair to them and fair to the white men. The Brazilian and Argentine navies have black ships." Unquote. Recruiting officers of the Navy have recently opened the doors to discharged Negro soldiers, and some civilians. If physically fit, they are permitted to enlist as machinists and electricians. The Navy has opened a school for machinists at Charleston, South Carolina, and a school for electricians at Hampton Roads, Virginia. Men for the machinist school are enlisted as firemen third class. While in training they are paid $30 a month. They also receive their clothing allotment, their food, dry, comfortable quarters in which to live, and all textbooks and practical working tools. In return for this chance to become proficient in a very necessary trade, all that is required of those enlisting is a knowledge of common fractions, ambition to learn the trade, energy, and a strict attention to the instruction given them. Subjects taught in the course are arithmetic, notebook sketching, practical engineering, theoretical engineering, clipping and filing, drilling, pipe fitting, repair work, rebabbiting, brazing, tinsmithing, lathes, shapers, milling machines and grinders. It will be seen that they get a vast amount of mechanical knowledge and practically two trades, machinists and engineering. In the electrical school the course is equally thorough. The men get a high grade of instruction, regardless of cost of material and tools. The best textbooks that can be had are available for their use. This liberality in order to get machinists and electricians in the Navy argues that some change of attitude towards the Negro is contemplated. It may evolve into the establishment of black ships. The Negro sailor has been pleading for years that his color has been a bar to him. With a ship of his own would come his chance. He would strive, do all within his power to make it a success, and would succeed. End of Recrudescence of South's Intolerance by W. Allison Sweeney.
Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by George Byron, Canto the Fourth, sections 93 through 96 and section 98. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by George Byron, Canto the Fourth, sections 93 through 96 and section 98. What from this barren being do we reap? Our senses narrow and our reason frail, life short and truth a gem which loves the deep, and all things weighed in custom's falsest scale. Opinion and omnipotence, whose veil mantles the earth with darkness, until right and wrong are accidents, and men grow pale, lest their own judgments should become too bright, and their free thoughts be crimes, and earth have too much light. And thus they plod in sluggish misery, rotting from sire to son and age to age, proud of their trampled nature, and so die, bequeathing their hereditary rage to the new race of inborn slaves who wage war for their chains, and rather than be free, bleed gladiator like, and still engage within the same arena where they see their fellows fall before, like leaves of the same tree. I speak not of men's creeds they rest between, man and his Maker, but of things allowed, averred and known, and daily, hourly seen, the yoke that is upon us doubly bowed, and the intent of tyranny avowed, the edict of earth's rulers who are grown, the apes of him who humbled once the proud, and shook them from their slumbers on the throne. Too glorious were this all his mighty arm had done. Can tyrants but by tyrants conquered be, and freedom find no champion and no child, such as Columbia saw arise when she sprung forth a Pallas armed and undefiled? Or must such minds be nourished in the wild, deep in the unpruned forest midst the roar of cataracts, where nursing Nature smiled on infant Washington? Has earth no more such seeds within her breast, or Europe no such shore? Yet freedom, yet thy banner, torn but flying, streams like the thunderstorm against the wind. Thy trumpet voice, though broken now and dying, the louder still the tempest leaves behind. Thy tree hath lost its blossoms, and the rind, chopped by the axe, looks rough and little worth, but the sap lasts, and still the seed we find, sown deep even in the bosom of the North. So shall a better spring less bitter fruit bring forth. End of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by George Byron, Canto the 4th, sections 93 through 96 and section 98, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 10, War and Conflict.
Sumter, a Ballad of 1861 by E. O. Murden, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Armentrout. Sumter, a Battle of 1861 by E. O. Murden, from the Songs and Ballads of the Southern People, collected and edited by Frank Moore, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. 'Twas on the 12th of April, before the break of day, we heard the guns of Moultrie give signal for the fray. Anon across the waters there boomed the answering gun. From north and south came flash on flash. The battle had begun. The mortars belched their deadly food, and spiteful whizzed the balls. A fearful storm of iron hailed on Sumter's doomed walls. We watched the meteor flight of shell, and saw the lightning flash, saw where each fiery missile fell, and heard the sullen crash. The morn was dark and cloudy, yet till the sun arose, no answer to our gallant boys came booming from our foes. Then through the dark and murky clouds the morning sunlight came, and forth from Sumter's frowning walls burst sudden sheets of flame. The shot and shell flew thick and fast, the war dogs howling spoke, and thundering came their angry roar through wreathing clouds of smoke. Again to fight for liberty our gallant sons had come. They smiled when came the bugle call, and laughed when tapped the drum. From cotton and from cornfield, from desk and forum too, from workbench and from anvil came our gallant boys and true. A hireling band had come to awe, our chains to rivet fast. Yon lofty pile scowls on our homes, seaward the hostile mast. But gallant freemen man our guns, no mercenary host, who barter for their honor's price, and of their baseness boast. Now came our stately matrons, and maidens too by scores. O Carolina's beauty shone like love lights on her shores. See yonder, anxious gazing, alone a matron stands, the teardrop glistening on each lid, and tightly clasped her hands. For there, exposed to deadly fire, her husband and her son. "Father," she spake, and heavenward looked, "Father, thy will be done." See yonder group of maidens, no joyous laughter now, for cares lie heavy on each heart, and cloud each anxious brow. For brothers dear and lovers fond are there amid the strife, tearful the sister's anxious gaze, pallid the promised wife. Yet breathed no heart one thought of fear. Prompt at their country's call, they yielded forth their dearest hopes, and gave to honor all. Now comes a message from below, oh quick the tidings tell! At Moultrie and Fort Johnson too, and Morris, all are well. Then mark the joyous brightening, see how each bosom swells, that friends and loved ones all are safe, each to the other tells. All day the shot flew thick and fast, all night the cannon roared, while wreathed in smoke stern Sumter stood, and vengeful answer poured. Again the sun rose bright and clear, 'twas on the 13th day, while lo, at prudent distant moored 5 hostile vessels lay, with choicest abolition crews, the bravest of their brave. They'd come to pull our crescent down and dig secession's grave. See, see how Sumter's battle trails, they're signaling for aid. See you no boats of armed men? Is yet no movement made? Now densest smoke and lurid flames burst out o'er Sumter's walls. "The fort's on fires!" the cry, again for aid he calls. See you no boats or vessels yet? Dare they not risk one shot to make report grandiloquent of aid they rendered not? Nor boat nor vessel leaves the fleet. "Let the old Major burn!" We'll boast of that we would have done, if but on our return. Go back, ye cravens, go back the way ye came, ye gallant would-be men of war. Go to your country's shame. Mid fiery storm of shot and shell, mid smoke and roaring flame, see how Kentucky's gallant son does honor to her name. See how he answers gun for gun. Hurrah! His flag is down. The white, the white, oh see it wave, is echoed all around. Now ring the bells, a joyous peal, and rend with shouts the air. We've torn the hated banner down and placed the crescent there. All honor to our gallant boys, bring forth the roll of fame, and there in glowing lines inscribe each patriot hero's name. Spread, spread the tidings far and wide, ye winds, take up the cry. Our soil's redeemed from hateful yoke, we'll keep it pure or die. End of Sumter, a ballad of 1861 by E. O. Murden, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
The Hero and Tin Soldiers by Henry Van Dyke, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA. The Hero and Tin Soldiers, from The Valley of Vision by Henry Van Dyke, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. On December 25th, 1918, that little white house in the park was certainly the happiest dwelling in Calvinton. It was simply running over with Christmas. You see, there had come to it a most wonderful present, a surprise full of tears and laughter. Captain Walter Mayne reached home on Christmas Eve. For a while they had thought that he would never come back at all. News had been received that he was grievously wounded in France, shot to pieces, in fact, leading his men near Chateau Thierry. His life hung on the ragged edge of those wounds, but his wife, Catherine, always believed that he would pull through. So he did, but he was lacking a leg. His right arm was knocked out of commission for the present, and various other souvenirs de la Grande Guerre were inscribed upon his body. Then word arrived that he was coming on a transport with other wounded to be patched up in a hospital on Staten Island. So his wife Catherine smiled her way through innumerable entanglements of red tape and went to nurse him. Then she set her steady hand to pull all the wires necessary to get him discharged and sent home. Christmas was in her heart, and she would not be denied. So it came to pass that the one-legged hero was in his own house on the happy day, and joy was bubbling all around him. When the old pastor entered late in the afternoon, the Christmas tree was twinkling with lights, the children swarming and buzzing all over the place, so that he was dazed for a moment. There were Walter's mother and his aunt and his sisters-in-law, boys and girls of various sizes, and a jubilant and entrancing baby. The pastor took it all in and was glad of it, but his mind was on the hero. Catherine, who always understood everything, whispered softly, "Walter is waiting to see you, Doctor. He is in his study, just across the hall." Waiting? Well, what can a man whose right leg has been cut off above the knee, and who has not yet been able to get an artificial one, what can he do but wait? The room was rather dimly lighted. Brilliance is not good for the eyes of the wounded. Walter was in a long chair in the corner. His face was bronzed, drawn and lined a little by suffering, but steady and cheerful as ever, with the eager look which had made his students listen to him when he talked to them about English literature. "My dear Walter," said the pastor, "we are so glad to have you home with us again. We are very proud of you. You are our hero." "Thank you," said Walter. "It is mighty good to be home again, but there is no hero business about it. I only did what all the other Americans who went over there did. Fought my best against the beastly Germans." "But your leg," said the pastor impulsively. "It is gone. Aren't you angry about that?" Walter was silent for a moment. Then he answered, "No, I don't think angry is the right word. You remember that story about Nathan Hale and the Revolution? I only regret that I have but one life to give to my country. Well, I'm glad that I had two legs to give for my country, and particularly glad that she only needed one of them." "Tell me about the fighting," said the pastor. "I want to know what it was like. The hero touch, you understand." "Not for me," said Walter, "and certainly not now. Later on I can tell you something, perhaps. But this is Christmas Day, and war—well, doctor, believe me, war is a horrible thing, full of grime and pain, madness, agony, hell, a thing that ought not to be. I have fought alongside of the other fellows to put an end to it. And now—" The door swung open, and Sammy, the eldest son of the house, pranced in. "Look, Daddy!" he cried. "See what Aunt Emily has sent me for Christmas! A big box of tin soldiers!" Mayne smiled as the little boy carefully laid the box on his knee, but there was a shadow of pain in his eyes, and he closed them for a few seconds, as if his mind were going back somewhere far away. Then he spoke, tenderly, but with a grave voice. "That's fine, sonny, all those tin soldiers, but don't you think they ought to belong to me? You have lots of other toys, you know. Would you give the soldiers to me?" The child looked up at him, puzzled for a moment. Then a flash of comprehension passed over his face, and he nodded valiantly. "Sure, father," he said. "You're the captain. Keep the soldiers. I'll play with the other toys." And he skipped out of the room. Mayne's look followed him with love. Then he turned to the old pastor, and a strange expression came into his face, half whimsical and half grim. "Doctor," he said, "will you do me a favor? Poke up that fire till it blazes. That's right. Now lay this box in the hottest part of the flames. That's right. It will soon be gone." The elder man did what was asked with an air of slight bewilderment, as one humors the fancies of an invalid. He wondered whether Mayne's fever had quite left him. He watched the fire bulging the lid and catching round the edges of the box. Then he heard Mayne's voice behind him, speaking very quietly. "If ever I find my little boy playing with tin soldiers, I shall spank him well. No, that wouldn't be quite fair, would it? But I shall tell him why he must not do it, and I shall make him understand that it's an impossible thing." Then the old pastor comprehended. There was no touch of fever. The one-legged hero had come home from the wars completely well and sound in mind. So the two men sat together in love by the Christmas fire, and saw the tin soldiers melt away. End of The Hero and Tin Soldiers by Henry Van Dyke. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.
Extract from The Life of Adam Martindale, written by himself, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. Now I was in a great strait how to dispose of myself. I abhorred to live idly, and burden my father, and besides I could no more be safe there than my brother Henry, for being above 18 years old, whereas 16 would have brought me in, I was as liable to the danger of dancing attendance at the general musters and thence to Bolton as he. To avoid both these inconveniences, if possible, though I was still rather too young, I inquired after a school. St. Helens was then newly disposed of, but Holland and Rainforth were both vacant. I took Holland for the liker place, there being a pretty church town, and a great number of freeholders and considerable yeomen in the neighbourhood. But I was there subject to so many great inconveniences. One, by the discouragements that many lay under to send their children in those days of constant alarms. Two, by the uncomfortableness of my habitation in a public house, to which many papists and drunkards did frequently resort. 3. By the disturbance given us by the soldiers often quartering among us, to the depriving us of our beds and chambers. 4. By the suspicion I lay under of being a Roundhead, that is, one for the Parliament, because my brother was gone to Bolton, and my father plundered upon it, and I could not clear myself from it by swearing and debauchery, but would have been quiet and meddled on no side. For these reasons, I say, I left the place when I had been there not much above a quarter of a year. Rainford being still open for me, I removed thither, having the promise of some substantial inhabitants that they would send me their children upon the usual rates that my predecessors had, and also find me my diet by turns, as was customary also there. The first they performed well, and I had a pretty full school. The second they never offered to do, but suffered me to depend upon my father for it, whose house had been so ransacked and stripped by rude soldiers that he had scarce necessary goods left him for the plainest sort of housekeeping. Besides, I had great disturbance given me by several papists about me, and by a pragmatical constable, animated as I thought by them, who, notwithstanding that the Parliament forces had so prevailed as to take Wigan and Warrington, Preston, and divers less considerable places, still warned me to musters. And though I excused myself as a piece of a clergyman, and kept away, I could not tell how it would go with me if I should be surprised and carried to Latham, counted then an impregnable place, where they did what they pleased within themselves. But among all these troubles I met with two cordials, helping to support my spirit. One, the marriage of my brother Henry to an holy young woman of pious parentage, with whom he lived comfortably at a new brick house, which he built near Warrington, thriving fast in goodness and his outward estate to his very death. She was after twice married, and lives with her third husband now in Manchester. 2. A sermon that I heard at St. Helens, preached by Mr. Smith, the minister there. He was under no great account for his abilities, but pious and serious, and in that sermon he did so lay forth the desperateness and damnableness of a natural estate without conversion, which before that time I had little minded, that I was roused to purpose, and this proved like a sharp needle, drawing after a silken thread of comfort in due season, so as, if I may without presumption lay claim to a work of grace, as I humbly hope, he was the chief instrument under God, and accordingly I honoured him as my spiritual father to his death. This mercy befell me as I was following my schoolwork diligently at Rainford, and writing a book of arithmetic for whole numbers and fractions, in the old method of record, Hill, Baker, etc. For then I knew nothing of decimals, logarithms, or algebra, but somewhat more contractedly, with an appendix of mine own invention, touching extracting the roots of fractions. What became of that manuscript I do not now remember, but probably it was left at Liverpool with the rest of my books. Now, being wearied out at Rainford by the inconveniences before mentioned, and being at the same time sent to by Colonel Moore, who was then newly come from London to garrison Liverpool, and to raise a regiment of foot with a troop of horse, to live with him as his clerk, I accepted the motion, and he carried towards me pretty civilly. And in regard he was the only justice of peace in that part of the county, besides his military employment, I got money under him so as might well have satisfied me. But his family was such an hell upon earth as was utterly intolerable. There was such a pack of arrant thieves, and they so artificial at their trade, that it was scarce possible to save anything out of their hands, except what I could carry about with me or lodge in some other house. Those that were not thieves, if there were any such, were generally, if not universally, desperately profane and bitter scoffers at piety, and these headed by one that had a mighty influence over the colonel, and was, I never knew why, become mine implacable enemy. I was therefore well content to come down a peg lower, accepting of the chief clerk's place in the foot regiment, which place, though below the other for profit and credit, gave me better content. For now I lived in peace, and enjoyed sweet communion with the religious officers of the company, which used to meet every night at one another's quarters by turns, to read scriptures, to confer of good things, and to pray together. My work also was easy enough, and such as gave me time for my studies, being only to keep a list of the officers' and soldiers' names, and to call them upon occasion. Nor was I to carry either musket, pike, halbert, or any other weapon, only for fashion's sake I wore a sword, as even ministers in those days ordinarily did. But in this condition I remained not long, for the quartermaster of the troop being no scholar, would needs have me into it, to assist him in making tickets, though under the name and notion of clerk of the troop, to whose office in strictness it belonged not. But that work was not great, and the rest of my employment was much what the same with that in the company. I was not by my office either to wear armour or buff-coat, to stand upon guard, or to ride out as a scout, and accordingly I was not furnished with a charging horse, war saddle, pistols, holsters, or carabine, but only with a little hackney, and an ordinary saddle and bridle, to ride along with the rest. And here also I had the comfort and benefit of some devout persons' company. After some time Mr. Thompson, the chaplain of the regiment, was sent to us to tender to us the covenant, and to satisfy any that should make scruple, which he did so effectually that I think not one refused it. In this easy employment of clerk of the troop and deputy quartermaster I continued till the taking of Liverpool by Prince Rupert, in which space of time the garrison at Latham, making some sallies out in the night, did such exploits as the colonels for the Parliament took for unsufferable affronts, and laid siege to it. This was instrumental to bring an old house upon our heads. For the Prince going to raise the siege at York, where he received a great overthrow, the Earl of Derby brought him through Lancashire, where his army after 2 smart repulses took Bolton by storm, the works having been slighted and in very bad order, putting about 1,800 to the sword. Then spreading themselves up and down the country, made woeful works wherever they came. My brother Henry was so lately married that he easily secured those few goods he had, together with himself and his wife, in the garrison at Warrington. My brother Thomas secured himself and some choice goods there also. But the rest, together with his poor wife and children, were at the mercy of his enemies, who were so severe that they scarcely left his family anything in the world to subsist on. But his great stocks of cattle were seized upon by a great papist in the neighbourhood, intentionally for his own use, but eventually for my brother. But my poor father sped much worse, for they took the old man prisoner, and used him most barbarously, forcing him to march in his stockings without shoes, and snapping his ears with their firelock pistols. His house, They plundered of everything they thought worth carrying away, in carts which they brought to his door to that purpose, and were sore troubled good men, that the walls being stone and the roof well shut over within, they could fasten no fire upon the house, though they several times essayed so to do. His stock of cattle they wholly drove away, and he never had an hoof again, amongst which was an excellent colt, almost ready for service, which, in regard of its high mettle and curious shapes, resembling its dam, which was a gallant mare, he valued an high rate. This being exceeding hard to be taken, they were resolved to shoot, out of perfect malice to him, but at last with difficulty they catched her, and away she went with the rest. Not long before this, when no such danger appeared as yet, there was a design set on foot by one Mr. Jerome, who preached at Sefton, for the setting up of a free school there. And I, being very weary of vagarying about with soldiers, and desirous to be in mine own element again, prevailed with him, who knew me well at Rainford and the character I was under there, to nominate me for schoolmaster, as accordingly he did. But blustering times coming on apace, that design wholly broke, and by that means I was still with the troop when the country was in the condition I even now mentioned. We were sent for to Liverpool with all speed and nothing but need, for we were in extreme danger to be surprised. Our captain was run away to the Prince's party, and no doubt would have thought it meritorious to betray us. An army was just at hand to lay close siege to our garrison. The siege at Latham being raised, the Lathamers ranged up and down at pleasure, and the sea-coast parishes assigned for our quarters almost wholly papists, especially as to the gentry. For mine own part, I was in as great dangers and straits as any single man could likely fall into. But because God was graciously pleased both to protect and support me, I shall in the conclusion of this chapter give them you under the heads of deliverances, as they deserve well to be called, especially some of them. The first, and that a most signal one, was this. We being riding in a full career, and I being nimbly though not strongly horsed, in the very front, my beast, for all his nimbleness, stumbled with that violence, that he pitched upon his forehead and threw his hinder parts over his foreparts, pitching me also upon my head so forcibly, that it was a wonder that my neck was not broken. Those that followed, coming in a single file, because of the straightness of the passage, in their full speed, never a one of them saw me till they were just upon me, nor could stay his horse when he did see me. But every one, which were almost all the troop, bounced clearly over my head, and not one set so much as one foot upon me. Methinks I can hardly be excused from niggardis in my returns, if I do not acknowledge this to be two, if not many, deliverances in one. 2. When Liverpool was surrendered upon terms of free quarter, though Prince Rupert's men upon their first entrance did, notwithstanding these terms, slay almost all they met with, to the number of 360, and among others divers of their own friends, and some artificers that never bore arms in their lives, yea, one poor blind man, yet the first that I met with offered me quarter before I asked. 3. Though I lost there in a manner all I had, viz., my mare, books, money, and clothes, and my relations were in such distress as even now I declared, I was sufficiently provided for, and my spirit cheerfully supported, throughout a tedious imprisonment of about 9 weeks, though I neither knew where I should be supplied for a week beforehand, nor by what means I could expect deliverance. 4. When I was at last set at liberty, a free school was vacant, and as it were waiting for me, in Over Whitley in Cheshire, with which I closed when I lacked a few weeks of 21 years old. And this was a perfect manumission from the hated life I had lived about 2 years among soldiers, though mine office was all along to employ my pen, not my sword, and to spend ink, not spill blood. If any one thinks I should, however, have made some other shift, and not have come among them, let him consider. 1. How young I was, viz., about 19 years of age. 2. What straits I was in. 3. All the ministers in our neighbourhood, to a man, except only 2 tippling boon companions, and all serious Christians, generally declared themselves satisfied with the cause of that party, among whom I sheltered myself, whose opinion and practice all those that think I should have slighted them must grant to be a strong temptation. End of extract from the life of Adam Martindale, written by himself, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.
The Ordered Away by Mrs. J. Jacobus, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Armentrout. The Ordered Away by Mrs. J. Jacobus, from the Songs and Ballads of the Southern People, collected and edited by Frank Moore. For the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. At the end of each street a banner we meet. The people all march in a mass, but quickly aside they step back with pride to let the brave companies pass. The streets are dense filled, but the laughter is stilled. The crowd is all going one way. Their cheeks are blanched white, but they smile as they lift their hats to the ordered away. They smile while the dart deeply pierces their heart, but each eye flashes back the war glance as they watch the brave file march up with a smile 'neath their flag with their muskets and lance. The cannon's loud roar vibrates on the shore, but the people are quiet today. As startled, they see how fearless and free march the companies ordered away. Not a quiver or gleam of fear can be seen, though they go to meet death in disguise, for the hot air is filled with poison distilled 'neath the rays of fair Florida's skies. Hark, the drum and fife awake to new life, the soldiers who can't get away, who wish, as they wave their hats to the brave, that they were the ordered away. As our parting grows near, let us quell back the tear. Let our smiles shine as bright as of yore. Let us stand with the mass, salute as they pass, and weep when we see them no more. Let no teardrop or sigh dim the light of our eye, or move from our lips, as they say, while waving our hand to a brave little band, goodbye to the ordered away. Let them go in God's name in defense of their fame, brave death at the cannon's wide mouth. Let them honor and save the land of the brave, plant freedom's bright flag in the South. Let them go while we weep and lone vigils keep. We will bless them and fervently pray to the God whom we trust for our cause firm but just, and our loved ones, the ordered away. When fierce battles storm, we will rise up each morn, teach our young sons the saber to wield. Should their brave fathers die, we will arm them to fly and fill up the gap in the field. Then fathers and brothers, fond husbands and lovers, march, march bravely on. We will stay, alone in our sorrow, to pray on each morrow for our loved ones, the ordered away. End of The Ordered Away by Mrs. J. Jacobus, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. Thinking of the Soldiers by General Mirabeau B. Lamar, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Armentrout. Thinking of the Soldiers by General Mirabeau B. Lamar, from the Songs and Ballads of the Southern People, collected and edited by Frank Moore, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict. We were sitting around the table just a night or two ago, in the little cozy parlor, with the lamplight burning low, and the window blinds half open for the summer air to come, and the painted curtains moving like a busy pendulum. Oh, the cushions on the sofa, and the pictures on the wall, and the gathering of comforts in the old familiar hall, and the wagging of the pointer lounging idly by the door, and the flitting of the shadows from the ceiling to the floor. Oh, they awakened in my spirit, like the beautiful in art, such a busy, busy thinking, such a dreaminess of heart, that I sat among the shadows with my spirit all astray, thinking only of the soldiers far away, of the tents beneath the moonlight, of the stirring tattoo sound, of the soldier in his blanket on the ground, of the icy winter coming, of the cold bleak winds that blow, and the soldier in his blanket on the snow, of the blight upon the heather, and the frost upon the hill, and the whistling, whistling ever, and the never, never still, of the little leaflets falling with the sweetest, saddest sound, and the soldier, oh, the soldier, in his blanket on the ground. Thus I lingered in my dreaming far away, till the spirit's picture painting seemed as vivid as the day, and the moonlight faded softly from the window opened wide, and the faithful, faithful pointer nestled closer by my side. And I knew that 'neath the starlight, though the chilly frosts may fall, that the soldier will be dreaming often of us all. So I gave my spirit's painting just the breathing of a sound, for the dreaming, dreaming soldier in his slumber on the ground. End of Thinking of the Soldiers by General Mirabeau B. Lamar, for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection 10, War and Conflict.